Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be hosting for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and thanks for tuning in. We're going to continue now our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. We've been reviewing English history and how the powers vacillated back and forth between the people and the Pope and the kings, the divine writers. Suffice it to say that when the people are stripped of their liberties and they're stripped of their rights to participate in government, in a representative form of government, the hierarchy, at this time, a union of church and state, becomes all-powerful. The Pope and the King become all-powerful. They become absolutely powerful, not being able to be challenged by the people. And they become oppressors. They deny the people the rights, and they take upon themselves all the prerogatives of government, leaving the people out of the decision-making process. And with that goes injustice, tyranny, and it defines all of history. Absolute power held in the hands of the Pope and his kings results in tyranny and lawlessness, top-down degradation. Now, we ended yesterday with a quote. It says, "The 15th century, however, surpassed all the preceding ages in corruption. The churches became the resorts of robbers, sodomites, and assassins. Popes, cardinals, bishops, and mere clerks exercised brigandage forcibly in the provinces and employed, as was most convenient, poison, the sword, and fire to free themselves from their enemies and despoil their victims." See the tyranny? This is what happens when the people have no rights, and all the power is vested in the Pope and the King, in the church united with the state. Now, he makes mention here of the Inquisition. It says, "The Inquisition lent its horrible ministry to popes and kings. In France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and England, it embraced in its 1,000 arms the victims of the cupidity of tyrants and put them to the most frightful tortures. The country was covered with legions of priests and monks who devoured the substance of the people and carried off to their impure retreats young girls and handsome youths, whom they again cast out, disgraced and dishonored. See, their abuses even went so far as to debauch the children under their ministries. And that still goes on today. The pedophile priest pandemic runs rampant, not just in the United States, not just in Germany, not just in Ireland, not just in Italy, but all over the world. It's a global problem. And it is a result of the power being taken away from the people and placed in the hands of the church state. It says the cities became the theaters of orgies and saturnalia, and the palaces of the bishops were filled with equipages for the chase, packs of dogs, troops of courtesans, minions, jugglers, and buffoons," unquote. The reader cannot fail to have observed the causes which led to the melancholy condition of affairs, both in state and in church, shown by the foregoing detail. There was no want of patriotism on the part of the English people, or of true piety on the part of the laity of the church. These were struggling in every way they could to establish reform and to make it effectual on both the state and the church. The wrongs inflicted upon them were not necessary to the church or sanctioned by any of her earliest teachings. They were inherent in the papal system, arose out of the temporal power, and grew in enormity as that power increased. So clearly R.W. Thompson saying is all of this injustice, all of this debauchery, everything is owed to this union of church and state. This absolute power, this divine right power. The doctrine of papal infallibility, and that somehow these popes are the replacements of the Son of God on earth. And you would think, if the popes seriously considered themselves Christ's vicars, that there would be the opposite condition, benevolence toward the people. But that's not the case, because they are not Christ's vicars. Now, the doctrine of passive obedience and submission to authority applied to the affairs of state prohibited the citizens from making any complaint against the conduct of the king and the government under penalty of severe punishment. Okay? They had no right to freedom of speech. If they criticized the government, then they were accused of subordination, of insubordination. They were accused of a treachery and treason. And since the state was the arm of the church, it was also an attack upon the church. And it says the same doctrine applied to the affairs of the church prohibited the layman, however conscientious, from expressing any disapprobation for the conduct of pope or priest under penalty of excommunication. You may not say a word against either the pope or his priests or his kings. Now that's absolute power. And along with that goes absolute corruption. Now, in the one case, the act was held to be a crime against the state. In the other, a sin against God. To say of a king that he was a tyrant was treason against the state. To say of a pope or a priest that he had committed murder, adultery, or any other crime was treason against God. This was the teaching of the false decretals. And to cover it up as a part of the doctrinal belief of the church, the popes have assumed that they act on earth in the place of God, that all their power is derived directly from God, and therefore that they are infallible and cannot err. When Emperor Constantine, addressing, quote, a company of bishops, unquote, said to them in the presence of Eusebius, quote, "You are bishops whose jurisdiction is within the church," unquote. He intended to limit their power and to deny them any authority over temporal affairs. But when he continued in these words, quote, "I also am a bishop, ordained by God to overlook whatever is external to the church," unquote, he asserted the divine right of kings. And when the popes, in order to gather all this external power into their own hands, built up the wonderful machinery of the papacy and obtained the consent of kings to receive temporal crowns at their hands, they made the doctrine of Constantine a part of the religious faith of the Roman Catholic Church, so that they, as the only infallible representatives of God on earth, should become the dispensers of crowns, the regulators of the internal affairs of nations, the authors of universal law, and consequently the irresponsible sovereigns of the world. With Pope Innocent III, the crown of England was held by divine right, and as God had entrusted the Pope of Rome with the sole authority to decide what was permitted or forbidden by its law, therefore he had a divine right higher than that of the king, by the authority of which he was entitled to say who should and who should not wear the crown. And as he was infallible and could not err, whensoever and howsoever he decided the question, passive obedience and submission to his decision became a religious duty to the faithful. And whosoever dared to question the correctness of his decision or challenge the legitimacy of his authority became ipso jure a heretic and liable to be cut off from the church and from all Christian association by the terrible sword of excommunication. This was the great and comprehensive power that absorbed all other powers. It held the kings in obedience to the popes, and they plotted together in every form of intrigue to make their united power so compact and unassailable that it should pass with death-like weight upon the people, both in the church and in the state, that they might remain unconscious of their degradation. Or, where one appeared bolder than the rest to fling defiance in their faces, he should be silenced by excommunication, if possible, but if not, by the rack and the dungeon or the faggot. We shall have occasion hereafter to see how this doctrine of the divine temporal authority and infallibility of the popes deals with the obligation of the most solemn oaths and promises when the pope regards them as opposed to the welfare of the church. But the readiness with which the popes released the English kings from their oaths to execute the principles of Magna Carta is too suggestive in this connection to be passed by without comment. It will readily be perceived that if these infallible popes acted in conformity with the law of the Church, then by that same law no faith whatever could be held with heretics. Undoubtedly, the power to release from the obligation of an oath is held to be an incident to the power to absolve from the consequences of sin. In order to justify its exercise, the oath must be to do something violative of the law of God and against the interests of the church, in which case it would be considered void, or something which, lawful in itself, would, if done, lead to one or the other of these consequences, in which case it would be binding without the exercise of the dispensing power. Upon which of these grounds the popes based their action in releasing the English kings from their obligations in reference to Magna Carta is of no consequence, any further than as their conduct served to illustrate practically the application of a doctrine regulated by a law of the Church. Viewed in either light, the result is the same. For example, whether they considered Magna Carta to be violative of the law of God or against the interests of the Church, and therefore unlawful, or that if its principles were carried out in England, either or both of these consequences would ensue, their opposition to it was based upon their divine right to judge of these things, and their power to dispense the kings from the observance of their oath was the necessary and logical consequence. That, in point of fact, they did consider it to be violative of the divine right of kings, because it conferred upon the people the right to participate in the affairs of government, is beyond all question true. So their opposition to the Magna Carta was that it allowed the people to participate in government. It resulted in the House of Commons, one of the houses of Parliament where the people's voice was heard and grievances were uttered, hoping to gain favor from the government, redresses from the government. But that, according to the popes and the kings, united together, church and state say, is an imposition upon the divine right of the pope and the king to govern without hindrance. Now, and being so considered, it was made a matter of religious faith that the principles of the Great Charter should not be executed in England. And why of religious faith? For the manifest reason that as the divine right necessarily included the right of kings to govern the people and the right of the popes to govern the kings, therefore it was an essential part of the doctrine and consequently of the law of the church. Now, if the reader will examine the charter, he will see how it violates this doctrine of divine right, and where it was in opposition to the doctrine of the law of the church, as understood by the infallible popes of that day, insofar as it conferred any rights upon the people. Its principles may be thus briefly summed up. Now listen to this. The Magna Carta prohibited unlawful amercements, distresses, and punishments. Okay, Magna Carta made it unlawful to unlawfully punish someone. It bound the hands of the government. The government had no right to just arbitrarily impose grief upon the people without cause. All right? Number 2, it gave the right to the owner of personal property to dispose of it by will. The Magna Carta prevented the government from interfering when a person wanted to leave a bequest to his family. It stripped the government of the right to come in and seize property of a deceased, and so that the deceased could pass on his property to his heirs. You see what the Magna Carta did? Basic human rights. And it established the right of dower. It gave uniformity to weights and measures. Let me give you an example of this. We all know when we pull up to the gas pump that there's a tag on every gas pump under I believe it's the Department of Agriculture. Every pump must have that seal. That pump must have gone through some test to make sure that the register on the gas pump delivered the exact amount of fuel that the customer pays for. Weights and measures. All right? That's a protection imposed by the government to protect the people. But on the other hand, our government has the right, or rather the Federal Reserve Bank, operating under the guise of the Treasury Department in the United States, can autonomously and without responsibility to anyone change the value of your money. So where is the standard of weights and measures, the protection of weights and measures with regard to the value of money? You see, when we were on the gold standard, a piece of gold, an ounce of gold represented so much wealth. And they couldn't just make gold, so they couldn't manipulate the amount of gold in circulation. But when they took us off the gold standard and put us on this fiat currency, they could print money as they pleased, and by printing, regulate the value of every dollar. And they can simply strip you of your wealth by printing too much money. They couldn't make gold, but they can make dollars or Federal Reserve notes as they choose. So there is no uniformity of weights and measures, at least not in the form of dollars, our money. The Magna Carta stripped from the government the power to manipulate weights and measures. It imposed upon the government fairness A basic right. A basic human right. All right? The Magna Carta forbade the alienation of lands in mortmain. Okay, here's a subject where I could have done a little more study before the program, but it was a practice of the church to seize properties and put it to its own use. In other words, the papacy at one time, and one place I read, controlled a third of the arable land of England. And all the wealth from that land went to the papacy and not to the nation. And you might imagine being in government how difficult it was, or being just a peasant, how difficult it was to make a living. When a third of the wealth-producing land was in the hands of the Pope. All right? The Magna Carta provided against undue delays in the administration of justice for assizes and circuits of the trial of causes. In other words, the Magna Carta gave speed to due process. It also provided for a trial of every accused freeman by a jury, and that no man's life, liberty, or property should be taken from him except by the judgment of his peers and the law of the land. Before, there was no trial by jury. There was no trial by your peers. Your trial took place in an inquisitorial court, and you were not even allowed to present evidence to your defense. The government simply declared you guilty and confiscated your property. You see what the Magna Carta was? It restored basic human rights. It was not an undue imposition on the king. The king should naturally not have the rights to abuse these areas of concern that we've just mentioned. And R.W. Thompson says, insofar as it affected the king, it, that is the Magna Carta, merely restrained his royal prerogative of preemption and purveyance, by which he may be allowed, by means of purveyors, to take whatever property of the citizen he needed, without his consent, and at whatever price he saw fit to pay, and to impress the carriages and the horses of a subject to do his business. It simply prevented the king from taking your property and doing whatever he wanted with it, without your consent and without giving you fair market value for it. In other words, it just prevented the king from being an outright criminal and a thief. Magna Carta was no imposition on any divine right of the Pope or the king to commit crime. Magna Carta, the basic human rights. We'll be back with more from Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio right after this.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Okay, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. We're talking about Magna Carta. And R.W. Thompson says, insofar as Magna Carta affected the king, it merely restrained his royal prerogative of preemption and purveyance, by which he had been allowed, by means of purveyors, to take whatever property of the citizen he needed without his consent and at whatever price he saw fit to pay, and to impress the carriages and horses of a subject to do his own business. The equivalent of this today would be that if a policeman was in a hot chase of a criminal and happened to wreck his car, the policeman had the right to get out of his car, come over to yours, draw his gun, and say, get out of your car, I need it. And then take your car without your permission, do with it as he sees fit, and if it be destroyed, you're just out. Okay? No redress of grievances. Now, it also included that in the time of war, the government could confiscate all private property and to use it to conduct crusades. Crusades against those that the church deemed to be heretics. In other words, to use your property to fight a religious war against godly people, like the Waldenses and the Albigensians, which we'll get to as we continue. Magna Carta prevented the divine writers from divinely violating every law of God. Now, and in order to show that these old barons felt keenly a sense of justice themselves and had a just appreciation of it in others, It contained this memorable sentence, quote, "We will sell to no man, we will not deny or delay to any man right or justice," unquote. Basic human rights. And the barons had their hearts in the right places, and that's why they fought so hard to maintain Magna Carta. Now, wherein by all this did the king surrender anything that ought, in right of justice, to belong to the crown? One would suppose that if the citizens of a country were entitled to any sort of freedom, or to have any share at all in the management of affairs, some provisions of this kind are indispensable. And yet we find those kings of England who were the mere creatures and tools of the Pope resolved upon denying them to the people, and the popes, under the pretense of being divinely required to do so, releasing them from their solemn oaths to observe them. So we've just read in this book case after case after case where whenever a king of England died and a successor was chosen, in order to gain the support and approbation of the people, he promised to abide by Magna Carta. But as soon as he took office, as many presidents of the United States do today, they reneged on their promise. Why? Because they've received an absolution from the Pope and a release from their commitment of their oath. This still goes on today. Presidential candidates can stand before the cameras, before God and before man, and declare certain things of which they have no intention, because the Pope absolves them. They can swear before the cameras on a Bible, their oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, the Magna Carta of the people, the Bill of Rights, and yet know as they utter the words, they are absolved from that oath before they ever speak it. Because the papacy has always absolved the kings from observing basic human rights. Magna Carta. Now you wonder why we have presidents who can win the popular vote and then turn around and be knaves. One example, plain example of this was George W. Bush, who said in private company, it got out in the press. He simply called the Constitution of the United States, if you'll pardon the expression, it was his, a goddamn piece of paper. Just a GD piece of paper. Now I ask my listeners the question, who was the God in George W. Bush's life that damned the Constitution of the United States? The answer is clear. And he said so publicly on EWTN. His God is the Pope. The same popes who absolved these English kings from observing and holding to the tenets of Magna Carta. George W. Bush, a papal proxy warrior, a crusader for the Pope, simply rendered the Constitution worthless. And out of it, we got a crusade, a proxy war for the popes. That's what happened. And it happened right before our very eyes. We just couldn't see it in the context of history. It still goes on today. Now, the plain and obvious meaning of all this is that according to the law of the papacy, as it was then understood and acted on by infallible popes, the people of England were not entitled to have any share in the affairs of their own government, for the reason that if they did, the power of the papacy would be weakened and the law of God violated. And such was the inevitable and logical result of the doctrine of divine right as understood and announced by Pope Innocent III, and such remains today its inevitable and logical result as understood and re-announced by Pope Pius IX. And again, he's talking about the syllabus of error. What does the law of the papacy, what was the law of the papacy then, is its law yet? Admit the law to exist, and its consequences cannot be escaped. They inevitably follow, as effect follows cause. Streams do not more certainly find their way to the sea than it follows from the recognition of the divine right of kings and popes that they become the sovereign masters of the world and all mankind their slaves. But Tom, we're supposed to accede to the higher powers. Romans chapter 13. We're supposed to be obedient to the government. Would God command his people to be obedient to a tyrant, to a pope, to an antichrist? In that case, the higher power is Jesus Christ himself, is it not? Man ought to obey God rather than men. Every Christian has a duty to obey his godly master. But when his master is the Pope of Rome, he has no obligation. He has an obligation to obey God and to denounce the Pope. Now we're going to continue. Chapter 16 of the book is entitled Wycliffe and the Lollards, or Wycliffe if you choose to pronounce his name that way. We're going to talk about religion and persecution, which antedates Protestantism. Lucius III and Innocent III persecute the Waldenses and the Albigenses. The Fourth Lateran Council, the Third Canon, provides for extirpating heretics and taking away their country. Law of the Church, acted upon by the 15th century by Innocent VIII, the practice of Innocent III under it, persecution made a religious duty, Reformation in Germany, Martin Luther and the Pope, Henry VIII and the Pope quarrel about supremacy, not faith. Protestants do not assist him. The Pope releases his subjects from their allegiance. Their adherents persecute each other. More and Fisher. Henry VIII, always a Roman Catholic in faith. He persecuted reformers and papists. Edward VI, the first Protestant king, he does not persecute papists. Gives the crown to Lady Jane Grey. Mary, the rightful heir, proclaimed queen. Her promise to the reformers that they shall not be disturbed in their religion. She refuses to be bound by her promise. The teachings of Rome. Mary's measures, all papal. And again, we're probably talking about Bloody Mary. Her persecution of Protestants, her marriage to Philip of Spain, the result of the league between Pope Paul III and Charles V. Cardinal Pole dictates policy of the English government. Persecutions continue. Hooper, Latimer, and Ridley, great reformers and martyrs for the faith. Elizabeth, she persecutes both papists and Protestants, is educated in the school of Rome, only seeks to substitute imperial Protestantism for imperial Romanism. Boy, this is going to be a busy subject, so let's get right to it. R.W. Thompson begins by saying it was impossible in the very nature of things that the condition of affairs portrayed in the last chapter could long exist in England without some material change. The barons had placed themselves between the people and the king, and were the representatives of principles of civil polity which they could not now surrender without an abandonment of the best interests of the country and their own honor. The Lollards, under the lead of Wycliffe, were similarly situated as it regarded the principles of religious belief and the affairs of the church. Upon one point they agreed, that is, the necessity for reform. The barons were laboring to reform the state, the Lollards, the church. The barons were not ready to concede that the king was the state, nor were the Lollards ready to concede that the Pope was the church. Such concessions on the part of both of them would have given an absolutism a perfect triumph over all the ancient liberties and would have left England completely subdued. She would then have been, in fact, a fief of the Holy See, with no claim whatever of an independent national existence. With her parliament constituted, as it then was, subordinated to the king, and with the king subordinated to the Pope, the people would have borne the same relations to the papacy that the people of the papal states did, that of entire dependence. The Pope, as a thorough politician, could see all this, and therefore left no possible means unemployed to hold both the barons and the Lollards in subjection. For whatever else he may have seen, it must have been apparent to him that unless the reform sought for by each was speedily checked, they would both ultimately reach the same common point of union, which would make them strong enough to materially weaken both the papal and the kingly power. As the controversy waxed warmer and warmer, the respective parties became more earnest and aggressive. The barons more determined not to yield, the Lollards more resolved upon church reform, and the Pope and the King more resolved upon keeping the church and the state so united in their combined power that would be sufficient to suppress all free inquiry and to keep the people in a condition of vassalage. It was an issue between power and right, the former represented by the Pope and the King, the latter by the people, in civil affairs under the lead of the barons, and the affairs of the church under the lead of the Lollards. As in all such controversies, power was inevitably resorted to force to keep itself in place. So it did in this. This force, however, did not proceed exclusively from the king and government of England, inasmuch as by this time the influences of the combined opposition had become too great for open resistance by the king and the parliament. But as the Pope had assumed to himself the divine prerogative of governing the country both in its civil and ecclesiastical policy, and held the king in complete subjection, the church was relied on as furnishing through its ecclesiastical organization, that is, through the priesthood, whatsoever was necessary in that direction to accomplish the desired end. See, they used the church to accomplish it. And it says the Pope's recognized right of dictation to the king made him responsible for the oppressive measures resorted to by the latter, while his position as the infallible head of the church made him equally responsible for the oppressive measures of the church. So the Pope is responsible for all of the abuses of this time, the abuses of the state and the abuses of the church. They all stemmed from the Pope, because the Pope declared himself not just the spiritual head of the church, but also the physical head, the temporal head of the government. Okay, my apologies. I'll continue now. He says, it is manifestly true that the principles of Magna Carta would have gone into immediate effect in England but for the interference of the Pope. For if he had not intervened between the king and the people by employing the authority of the church to release the king from the obligation of his oath, the barons, backed by the people, would have been able to hold him to his promise. And thus we find all the measures of compulsion employed against the barons and the Lollards traceably directly to the papacy, and made effectual as far as they could be by means of the immense number of foreign ecclesiastics scattered throughout the kingdom, who, as the emissaries of the Pope, dictated to the king whatsoever measures were necessary to keep the people in check. And hence we find also that a measure of ecclesiastical policy was adopted and made a part of the canon law of the Church during the pontificate of Innocent III, which makes the papacy immediately and directly responsible for all the force and persecution employed, not only in England, but elsewhere, to keep the people in subjection and repress reform both in state and church. In the year 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council was held in Rome under the direct personal guidance of Pope Innocent III, to whom, as already shown, King John surrendered the crown of England. This is conceded to have been the 12th Ecumenical Council, and its enactments are consequently regarded as part of the canon law, equally binding upon the faithful at all times, as much so now as when they were originally passed. In one canon adopted by this council, certain heresies were condemned. In another, heretics were excommunicated. And in another, it was provided that they should be exterminated. See how the papacy's power has grown from just condemning certain heresies, then compounded later by the power to excommunicate, and then ultimately to sentence a heretic to be burned. Is this what God wants? R.W. Thompson continues, he says, "Here we reach a point of vast importance to the present times, and ground upon which it is necessary and right that we should tread with great caution, so as not to mislead ourselves or others. For if it be true that what is here alleged constitutes a part of the law of the Roman Catholic Church, having by the action of a general council and the assent of a pope the impress of infallibility stamped upon it, then it will not do to say, as the papal writers do, that persecution arose out of Protestantism and was of Protestant growth. For it must be observed that at the time referred to, there was no such thing as Protestantism known. Wycliffe, who had been properly called the morning star of the Protestant Reformation, was not born till the year 1325, and therefore the Lollards, who were his followers in England, had not yet arisen. The Waldenses or Vaudois had been excommunicated for heresy by Lucius III, who was pope from the year 1181 till 1185, and they were afterward condemned for teaching, contrary to the practice of the Roman Catholic Church, that the unworthiness of the Roman Catholic clergy rendered them incapable of their ministry. Pope Innocent III inaugurated measures of his own accord in the year 1198, the first of his pontificate, to extirpate the Albigenses. The next year he ordered their estates to be confiscated. He ordered the abbots and monks not only to preach against them, but to, quote, excite the princes, to excite the princes and people to extirpate them, and to form a crusade against them, unquote. The monks and abbots of the Roman Catholic Church, following the instructions of the papacy, incited the kings and the princes and the peoples to go on a crusade to wipe them out, simply because they condemned the debauchery, the unfitness of the Roman Catholic priests to be priests. Now, Raymond, Count of Toulouse, a leader among the Albigenses, caused one of these missionaries to be assassinated, for which he was required to retract his errors and to deliver up several of his towns to the Pope as the price of his absolution, which was granted him. After this was done, as the Crusaders had no further contest with Raymond, they turned their arms against the town of Béziers, where the Albigenses were fortified, besieged, took, and burned the town, and put all the inhabitants, quote, to the edge of the sword, unquote. See the hypocrisy? And it says the particular heresies, therefore, with which the Church had to deal during the pontificate of Innocent III were those of the Waldenses and the Albigenses, and consequently it is to these that the decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council were specially directed. All of this predated the existence of the Lollards and the birth of Protestantism. But when Protestantism began subsequently to arise, the law of the Church was already prepared to visit upon the Protestants the same measure of pontifical vengeance as had been visited upon the inoffensive Waldenses and Albigenses. The torch of persecution lighted for the latter was kept continually aflame in readiness for the former. The Fourth Council of Lateran, being assembled to deal, among other things, with the heresies then existing, it was considered necessary that it should be so attended as to represent the universal Church. To effect this, 2 years were permitted to pass between the time when it was called by Pope Innocent III and its first meeting in November of 1215. It contained 412 bishops in person, 800 abbots and priors, and a great many deputies of absent prelates who were excused from attending. There were also ambassadors from the following courts: Constantinople, Sicily, Germany, France, England, Hungary, Jerusalem and Cyprus, Aragon, and from those of other princes. And I see we've run out of time, so we'll have to pick up where we left off tomorrow on the broadcast. I hope you'll find this educational, soul-searching, and corrective. And it's my pleasure to read such a wonderful book on First Amendment Radio, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. What a privilege. Thank you, Brother Nicholas, and we'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.